Three amateur treasure hunters entered the abandoned Copper Ridge mine on a sunny April morning in 2009 and simply never came back, vanishing without a trace despite carrying GPS devices and emergency supplies. For 6 years, the mine kept its deadly secrets while families searched desperately for answers that seemed lost forever, until a routine geological survey uncovered a weathered leather crossbody bag buried deep in a collapsed tunnel with a journal inside that would reveal the horrifying truth about what really happened in those dark underground passages. The fluorescent lights of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department flickered overhead as Detective Maria Santos stared at the evidence bag on her desk. Inside was a mud-stained leather crossbody bag, its once brown surface now a mottled gray from years underground. The bag had been delivered that morning by a team of geological surveyors who'd found it while mapping unstable sections of the old Copper Ridge mine. What made Detective Santos's hands tremble slightly as she held the bag wasn't its condition, but the name embossed in faded gold letters on the front flap: Chloe Brennan. That name had haunted the department for 6 years. Chloe Brennan, along with her companions Marcus Webb and Tyler Novak, had disappeared into the Copper Ridge mine on April 15, 2009. They were amateur treasure hunters, part of a growing community of weekend adventurers who scoured abandoned mines and ghost towns across the Southwest, searching for forgotten relics and lost fortunes. The trio had been experienced enough to know the basics of mine safety, carrying helmets, flashlights, rope, and GPS devices. They'd even filed a basic exploration plan with the local ranger station, something most treasure hunters never bothered to do. The Copper Ridge mine had been abandoned since 1952, when the last copper vein played out and the mining company pulled their equipment. It sat in a remote section of the Mojave Desert, accessible only by a rough dirt road that wound through Joshua trees and scattered boulders. The mine's entrance was a dark mouth carved into a hillside, with rusted warning signs and a chain-link fence that had been cut and repaired so many times it was more hole than barrier. Local authorities had tried repeatedly to seal the mine permanently, but treasure hunters and urban explorers always found a way in. The mine was a magnet for people seeking adventure and fortune, and it had claimed lives before. When Khloe, Marcus, and Tyler failed to return from their planned day trip, their families contacted authorities immediately. The three had been meticulous planners, always checking in by cell phone every few hours during their expeditions. When their phones went silent and they missed their scheduled 6 p.m. check-in call, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The initial search was massive and immediate. Riverside County Search and Rescue deployed teams into the mine within hours, supported by specialized cave rescue units from neighboring counties. They found the trio's pickup truck parked at the mine entrance, their camping chairs still set up nearby with half-eaten sandwiches on a folding table. Their backup supplies remained untouched in the truck bed. Everything suggested they had planned to return quickly. The mine itself was a labyrinth of tunnels, shafts, and chambers that extended deep into the hillside. Decades of abandonment had made it treacherous, with unstable ceiling supports, hidden vertical shafts, and pockets of toxic gases. The search teams worked methodically, mapping every accessible tunnel and chamber. They found evidence of recent human passage in several areas, footprints in the dust, disturbed rocks, and even a few candy bar wrappers that appeared fresh. But of Khloe, Marcus, and Tyler themselves there was no sign. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, the official rescue operation was scaled back. The mine had been thoroughly explored, every accessible area mapped and cleared. The conclusion was devastating but seemed inescapable. The three treasure hunters had somehow become lost in an unmapped section of the mine, possibly trapped by a collapse or fallen into an unmarked shaft. The mine was simply too vast and too dangerous to search indefinitely. The case remained open, but cold. Khloe's parents, Robert and Linda Brennan, never stopped believing their daughter was still alive somewhere in those tunnels. They hired private search teams, consulted with mine engineers, and even brought in psychics and dowsers. Marcus's brother Jake became obsessed with the case, spending weekends at the mine entrance with metal detectors and climbing gear, convinced he could find clues the official search had missed. Tyler's girlfriend Sarah moved away from California entirely, unable to bear the constant reminders of his disappearance. The families held annual memorial services at the mine entrance, placing flowers and photos against the rusted warning signs. Now, 6 years later, Detective Santos held the first tangible evidence of what had happened to the missing treasure hunters. The crossbody bag was clearly Khloe's. The geological survey team had found it in a section of tunnel that had been inaccessible during the original search, blocked by what appeared to be a relatively recent rockfall. Inside the bag, wrapped in a plastic Ziploc bag that had protected it from moisture and decay, was Khloe's journal. The journal was a small, leather-bound notebook that Khloe had carried on all her treasure hunting expeditions, documenting their discoveries, mapping tunnel systems, and recording her thoughts about their adventures. Detective Santos knew that whatever was written in those pages would finally answer the questions that had tormented 3 families for 6 long years. The journal's pages were yellowed and brittle, but the plastic bag had preserved Khloe's handwriting remarkably well. Detective Santos opened it carefully, her latex gloves making the pages difficult to turn. The entries began normally, filled with Khloe's characteristic enthusiasm and meticulous attention to detail. The first few pages documented their preparation for the Copper Ridge expedition, including hand-drawn maps copied from old mining surveys and a list of equipment they'd packed. Khloe had written about her excitement over rumors of a hidden chamber deep in the mine, where workers had supposedly stashed valuable copper ore during the mine's final days. She'd researched the mine's history extensively, discovering that the last shift supervisor, a man named Heinrich Volker, had disappeared along with several $1,000s worth of refined copper just before the mine's official closure in 1952. The early journal entries painted a picture of 3 friends embarking on what they believed would be their biggest treasure hunting adventure yet. Khloe wrote about Marcus's new metal detector, a high-end model he'd saved months to purchase, and Tyler's excitement over the cave mapping software he'd downloaded to his GPS device. They'd planned to spend the entire day systematically exploring the mine's main tunnels, using Tyler's GPS to create a detailed map, while Marcus swept for metal signatures that might indicate hidden caches. The tone of the entries was optimistic and professional, exactly what Detective Santos would have expected from experienced treasure hunters. But as she continued reading, the entries began to change. The handwriting became more hurried, the tone more urgent. On what appeared to be their second day in the mine, Khloe wrote about finding something unexpected. They'd discovered a section of tunnel that didn't appear on any of their historical maps, a narrow passage that branched off from the main shaft about 800 feet from the entrance. Marcus's metal detector had picked up strong signals from deep within this unmapped tunnel, readings that suggested a large concentration of metal objects. Against their better judgment, they'd decided to investigate. The passage was barely wide enough for a single person, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees for nearly 200 feet before it opened into a natural cavern. Khloe's description of the cavern was detailed and unsettling. She wrote about strange rock formations that looked almost deliberately carved, and a ceiling that disappeared into darkness beyond their flashlight beams. Most disturbing were the bones they'd found scattered across the cavern floor, animal bones that Tyler had identified as belonging to desert bighorn sheep, coyotes, and other local wildlife. The bones were old, bleached white by time, but there were so many of them that the cavern floor was carpeted with skeletal remains. Marcus's metal detector had gone wild in the cavern, registering strong signals from multiple directions. They'd begun digging in the area with the strongest readings, and had quickly uncovered what appeared to be mining equipment from the 1950s, tools and machinery that had been deliberately buried under rocks and debris. Hidden beneath the equipment, they'd found wooden crates filled with refined copper ingots, exactly the kind of valuable ore that Heinrich Volker had supposedly stolen decades earlier. Khloe's excitement was palpable in her writing as she described their discovery, calculating that the copper alone was worth tens of thousands of dollars at current market prices. But their celebration had been short-lived. As they'd worked to uncover more of the hidden cache, Tyler had noticed something troubling about the cavern's entrance. The narrow passage they'd crawled through to reach the chamber was showing signs of instability, with loose rocks falling periodically from the ceiling. More concerning was a subtle but persistent vibration they could feel through the rock, as if something heavy was moving in the tunnels above them. Tyler had insisted they leave immediately and return with proper mining engineers to assess the stability of the area before attempting to remove their discovery. That's when everything had gone wrong. As they'd prepared to leave the cavern, carrying only a few small copper samples as proof of their find, they'd heard a sound that Khloe described as like thunder underground. The narrow passage they'd used to enter the cavern had collapsed completely, sealing them inside the chamber with no way out. Khloe's handwriting became increasingly frantic as she described their immediate attempts to dig through the rockfall, using their hands and the few tools they'd brought to try to clear a path back to the main tunnel. But the collapse had been massive, filling the entire 200-foot passage with tons of rock and debris. The journal entries from their first day trapped in the cavern revealed the full horror of their situation. They had water for perhaps 2 days, energy bars for maybe 3 if they rationed carefully, and no way to communicate with the outside world. Their cell phones had no signal in the deep cavern, and their GPS device, while still functioning, showed their location as being nearly 1,000 feet underground in an area that didn't officially exist on any mine map. Tyler had tried repeatedly to find alternative exits from the cavern, exploring every crack and crevice in the rock walls, but the chamber appeared to be completely sealed, except for the now blocked passage they'd used to enter. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Khloe's journal revealed that Marcus had taken charge of their survival efforts, rationing their supplies and organizing systematic attempts to signal for help. They'd used their flashlights to create light patterns near the cavern entrance, hoping that search teams might notice the glow filtering through cracks in the rockfall. They'd also tried making noise by banging metal tools against the rock walls, creating rhythmic patterns that might be heard by rescuers in the main tunnels. But as the days passed with no response, their hope had begun to fade. The journal entries from their 4th day trapped revealed a growing desperation that Detective Santos found difficult to read. Khloe's handwriting had become shaky, reflecting not just physical weakness from rationing food and water, but the psychological strain of their impossible situation. She wrote about Marcus developing a persistent cough from the dust they'd stirred up during their digging attempts, and Tyler's growing obsession with finding another way out of the cavern. He'd begun exploring areas of the chamber they'd initially dismissed as impassable, squeezing into narrow cracks between rocks and disappearing for hours at a time, while Khloe and Marcus waited anxiously for his return. On the 5th day, Tyler made a discovery that initially seemed like salvation, but quickly revealed itself as something far more sinister. Deep in the back of the cavern, hidden behind a wall of fallen boulders, he'd found another passage. Unlike the narrow tunnel they'd used to enter, this passage was wide enough to walk upright and showed clear signs of human construction, with wooden support beams and carved stone walls. Most importantly, air was flowing through the passage, suggesting it connected to the surface somewhere. Khloe's relief was evident in her writing as she described their decision to follow this new tunnel, carrying their remaining supplies and the few copper samples they'd managed to collect. The passage led steadily upward through a series of natural chambers and man-made tunnels that clearly predated the official Copper Ridge mine. Khloe wrote about finding old mining equipment that looked much older than the 1950s gear they'd discovered in the first cavern, pickaxes and shovels with wooden handles that crumbled at the touch. More disturbing were the personal items they'd begun finding scattered throughout the tunnels: old leather boots, tattered clothing, and metal objects that Tyler identified as belonging to miners from the late 1800s. The passage wasn't just an escape route, it was a tomb filled with the remnants of men who died underground decades before the official mine had even been established. As they'd climbed higher through the ancient tunnel system, following the flow of fresh air that promised escape, they'd made increasingly disturbing discoveries. Khloe documented finding human remains in several of the chambers, skeletons still wearing the remnants of period clothing and mining gear. Some appeared to have died from cave-ins or accidents, but others showed signs of violence, skulls with obvious fractures and bones scattered in ways that suggested the bodies had been deliberately hidden. Tyler had theorized that they'd stumbled into the remnants of an illegal mining operation from the 1880s, possibly connected to claim jumping or other criminal activities that had been covered up when the official mine was established decades later. The fresh air had led them through nearly 2 miles of underground passages before they'd finally reached what appeared to be an exit, a vertical shaft with wooden ladder rungs leading up toward a circle of daylight far above. But their relief had been short-lived. The ladder was ancient and rotted, with many rungs missing or broken. Worse, the shaft was nearly 200 feet deep, far too dangerous to climb without proper equipment. They could see freedom above them, could feel the desert wind and smell the sagebrush, but they were still effectively trapped underground with no way to reach the surface. Khloe's journal entries from this period revealed the psychological toll their ordeal was taking. Marcus had become increasingly withdrawn, spending hours staring up at the unreachable circle of daylight above them. Tyler had grown obsessed with the historical mystery they'd uncovered, documenting every artifact and skeleton they'd found as if creating a record was more important than finding a way out. Khloe herself had begun experiencing what she described as waking nightmares, vivid hallucinations brought on by dehydration and stress that made her see movement in the shadows and hear voices calling from the deeper tunnels. Their water had run out on the 7th day, and their food was nearly gone. Khloe wrote about the difficult decision to explore deeper into the tunnel system, hoping to find either another exit or a source of water. They'd discovered an underground stream in one of the lower chambers, but the water was contaminated with mineral runoff that made them violently ill when they tried to drink it. Marcus had suggested they try to purify the water by boiling it, but their small camping stove had run out of fuel days earlier. They were slowly dying of thirst while surrounded by water they couldn't safely drink. The journal's tone became increasingly dark as Khloe documented their deteriorating condition. Marcus's cough had worsened into what sounded like pneumonia, and Tyler had injured his leg badly during one of his exploration attempts, leaving him barely able to walk. Khloe herself was experiencing severe dehydration symptoms, including confusion and difficulty concentrating, that made her handwriting nearly illegible in places. She wrote about the terrible irony of their situation, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of copper and historical artifacts, while slowly dying of thirst and starvation. On what appeared to be their 9th day underground, Khloe made an entry that Detective Santos found particularly heartbreaking. She'd written letters to her parents, to Marcus's family, and to Tyler's girlfriend, knowing that the journal might be the only record of their final days that would ever be found. The letters were filled with love and regret, apologies for the pain their disappearance would cause, and detailed instructions about where to find their bodies when search teams eventually discovered the hidden tunnel system. She'd also included a detailed map of their route through the underground passages, hoping it might help future explorers avoid the same fate. The final entries in the journal were brief and increasingly incoherent, reflecting Khloe's deteriorating mental state. She wrote about Marcus becoming delirious with fever, talking to people who weren't there, and trying to dig through solid rock with his bare hands. Tyler had stopped moving entirely, lying motionless in one of the chambers while Khloe tried desperately to keep him conscious. In her last coherent entry, dated what she believed was their 11th day underground, Khloe wrote about her decision to continue exploring alone, hoping to find help before it was too late for her companions. The final pages of Khloe's journal were the most disturbing Detective Santos had ever read in her 15 years of law enforcement. Khloe's handwriting had deteriorated to barely legible scrawls, the words wandering across the page as dehydration and exhaustion took their toll. She wrote about leaving Marcus and Tyler in what she called the bone chamber, a natural cavern filled with the skeletal remains of the 1880s miners they'd discovered. Both men were unconscious, their breathing shallow and irregular, and Khloe knew she had only hours to find help before they died. Her solo exploration had led her deeper into the tunnel system than they'd ever ventured before, following air currents and the faint sound of what she hoped might be surface activity. The passages in this section were different from the others, carved with precision that suggested they'd been used for something other than mining. Khloe described finding chambers filled with wooden crates and metal containers, some still sealed and others broken open to reveal contents that made no sense in the context of a copper mine. She'd found boxes of old photographs, stacks of legal documents, and what appeared to be personal belongings from multiple time periods spanning decades. In one chamber, Khloe had made a discovery that explained the true nature of the underground complex. Hidden behind a false wall, she'd found a room that had clearly been used as living quarters, complete with beds, cooking equipment, and personal items that suggested someone had lived underground for an extended period. More disturbing were the journals and documents she'd found in this hidden room, written by Heinrich Volker, the mine supervisor who'd disappeared in 1952. Volker's writings revealed that he hadn't stolen copper and fled as everyone had assumed. Instead, he'd discovered the ancient tunnel system and the evidence of the 1880s murders, and had been using the underground complex as a base for his own criminal activities. Volker's journals described a network of criminals who'd used the hidden tunnels to store stolen goods and hide from law enforcement throughout the early 1900s. The complex had served as an underground warehouse for everything from stolen cattle to bootleg liquor during Prohibition. More horrifying were Volker's accounts of what had happened to people who'd discovered the tunnels accidentally over the years. He'd written about dealing with prospectors, hikers, and other explorers who'd stumbled onto the secret, describing their deaths in clinical detail that suggested he'd killed multiple people to protect the operation. Khloe's discovery of Volker's room had given her hope that she might find supplies or equipment that could help save Marcus and Tyler. But the room had been abandoned for decades, its contents either rotted away or rendered useless by time and moisture. Worse, she'd found evidence that Volker himself had died in the tunnels, his skeletal remains sitting in a chair at a wooden desk where he'd apparently been writing when death finally claimed him. His final journal entry, dated 1954, described his own deteriorating health and his realization that he would never leave the underground complex alive. The psychological impact of these discoveries was evident in Khloe's increasingly erratic writing. She described feeling watched by the ghosts of Volker's victims, hearing voices calling from the deeper tunnels and seeing movement in the shadows that disappeared when she turned her flashlight toward it. The isolation and horror of her situation had begun to break down her grip on reality, but she'd continued exploring, driven by desperate hope that she might still find a way to save her friends. Her final coherent entries described finding what appeared to be another exit, a narrow chimney that led upward toward what looked like natural light. But like the previous shaft they'd discovered, this one was too dangerous to climb without proper equipment. The walls were loose and crumbling, and several times during her exploration, rockfalls had nearly buried her alive. She'd managed to climb about 50 feet up the chimney before being forced to retreat when the handholds began giving way beneath her weight. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because stories like this remind us why some places should remain unexplored. And we have more incredible mysteries coming your way. Khloe's last entries revealed her growing acceptance that she and her friends were going to die in the tunnels. She'd written about returning to the bone chamber to find Marcus already dead, his body still and cold in the darkness. Tyler was barely breathing, unconscious and unresponsive to her attempts to wake him. She'd stayed with him for what she estimated was another day, talking to him and holding his hand as his breathing gradually slowed and finally stopped. Alone in the darkness with the bodies of her two best friends, Khloe had made the decision to continue exploring, not because she believed she could escape, but because she couldn't bear to sit in the chamber waiting to die. Her final entries were brief and increasingly disconnected from reality. She wrote about conversations with Marcus and Tyler as if they were still alive, describing plans they were making for future treasure hunting expeditions. She documented finding more chambers filled with artifacts and remains, but her descriptions became fantastical, including references to underground cities and vast treasure hoards that clearly existed only in her dehydrated, dying mind. The journal's final entry was a single sentence, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely readable. "I can see the stars through the ceiling now." Detective Santos knew that Khloe had been hallucinating in her final moments, her brain shutting down from dehydration and starvation. The entry was dated what Khloe believed was their 15th day underground, though Detective Santos suspected she'd lost track of time and the actual period might have been longer or shorter. The geological survey team that had found Khloe's bag had also discovered her remains in a small chamber, about half a mile from where Marcus and Tyler's bodies were eventually located. She died alone in the darkness, her body positioned as if she'd simply laid down to rest and never woken up. The crossbody bag had been clutched tightly in her arms, suggesting that even in her final moments, she'd been determined to preserve the record of what had happened to them. The discovery of the journal had provided the closure that 3 families had desperately needed for 6 years, but it had also revealed a horror that went far beyond a simple treasure hunting accident. The underground complex beneath Copper Ridge Mine was a crime scene spanning more than a century, filled with the remains of dozens of victims who died at the hands of criminals like Heinrich Volker. Detective Santos knew that the investigation was far from over and that the tunnels would need to be thoroughly explored and documented before they could finally be sealed forever. The revelation of what lay beneath Copper Ridge Mine sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and the families who had waited 6 years for answers. Detective Santos immediately contacted the FBI, recognizing that the scope of the crimes described in Khloe's journal extended far beyond her department's jurisdiction. Within days, a joint task force was assembled, bringing together federal agents, forensic anthropologists, and specialized cave rescue teams to begin the grim work of exploring and documenting the underground complex. The recovery operation was unlike anything the investigators had ever undertaken. Using Khloe's detailed maps and journal entries as guides, teams descended into the tunnel system with advanced lighting equipment, air quality monitors, and body recovery gear. The first priority was retrieving the remains of Khloe, Marcus, and Tyler, bringing them home to families who had never stopped hoping for their return. The bone chamber that Khloe had described was exactly where her map indicated, a natural cavern filled with the skeletal remains of at least 12 individuals from different time periods. Heinrich Volker's hidden room became the focal point of the investigation. FBI forensic accountants worked to decode his journals and financial records, uncovering evidence of criminal activities that had spanned decades. The underground complex had served as a hub for cattle rustling, bootlegging, and eventually more serious crimes including kidnapping and murder. Volker's meticulous record-keeping revealed the names of accomplices, the locations of other criminal operations, and most importantly, the identities of many of his victims. The families of Khloe, Marcus, and Tyler finally received the closure they had desperately needed, but it came with the terrible knowledge of what their loved ones had endured in their final days. Robert and Linda Brennan held a memorial service for their daughter at the mine entrance, reading excerpts from her journal that celebrated her courage and determination, even in the face of certain death. Marcus's brother Jake, who had spent years searching for answers, found some peace in knowing that his brother had died trying to help his friends rather than from a careless accident. The treasure hunting community was deeply shaken by the revelations. Online forums that had once celebrated the trio's adventures became memorials to their memory, with experienced explorers sharing safety protocols and warning others about the dangers of exploring unmapped underground areas. The Copper Ridge Mine became a symbol of how quickly adventure could turn to tragedy, and several treasure hunting organizations implemented new safety requirements for their members. The mine itself was permanently sealed by federal authorities, with concrete barriers installed at every known entrance and warning signs posted throughout the area. The underground complex was declared a federal crime scene and archaeological site, protected by law from future exploration. The copper ore that had originally drawn Khloe, Marcus, and Tyler to their deaths was left undisturbed, a fortune in metal that would remain forever buried with the victims of Heinrich Volker's crimes. Detective Santos kept Khloe's journal in her office long after the case was officially closed, reading it whenever she needed to remind herself why her work mattered. The young woman's courage in documenting their ordeal, even as she faced certain death, had not only provided closure to grieving families but had also exposed a century of hidden crimes. Khloe's final act had been to ensure that the truth would eventually be known, that the victims who had died before them would finally be identified and remembered. If this story has moved you as much as it has moved us, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that reveal the hidden mysteries of our world. The Copper Ridge Mine case serves as a reminder that some treasures come at too high a price, and that the greatest discoveries are sometimes the ones that should have remained buried forever. The three friends who entered those tunnels seeking adventure and fortune had instead uncovered a dark chapter of history, paying the ultimate price to bring justice to victims who had been forgotten for decades.